So we're going to bring on stage someone who's far more interesting than I am. Please put your hands together for Chris Wright, CTO of Red Hat. All right. Hello, sir.
That was good.
That was weird, is what that was.
He put into his contract no breakdancing. Otherwise, it was gonna be magic.
Yeah, no, you don't want to see that. That's very bad. It's worse than dad dancing. So before we get started, and if the AV people could stick a clock on the screen, that would be very helpful to both of us. Just tell us a little bit about yourself. Tell us about your background, because you spent some time as a kernel developer, and you've been involved in projects like Open Daylight. So let's hear a little bit for those of us who don't know about you, shall we say.
Sure. So, Chris Wright, love long walks on the beach, action movie. No, this is an awkward date. I started as a engineer doing work in the telecommunications field. And all of the work that I did was proprietary software, and it was all developed using open source tool chains.
Right.
And so Sunsight was the place to go to get all the good stuff. And somewhere along the way, I fell into a project called Linux HA, and I was responsible for the availability of our platform, which in telecommunications world, big deal.
Yep.
And through a series of totally random events, really, I just kept meeting interesting people at conferences, and I ended up working on really interesting technology in the kernel and security spaces specifically, and then ultimately virtualization, and it all kind of one thing leads to the next, and it was software-defined infrastructure and SDN, and it became really buzzword compliant, and I have not left buzzword compliance since then. So that's the nickel tour.
So it's just essentially just bouncing as the technology was evolving, you were just finding your home in these different places that were evolving, which I think is one of the most incredible things that I'm sure many people here have had a similar experience. What led you to, how did you get to Red Hat?
That's a great question. So I was working on a virtualization project, hypervisor project called Zen, and the CTO at the time was really working hard to recruit me to come to Red Hat. And I was working for a nonprofit organization called OSDL, which would now be better known as the LF.
Yep.
And I really had a great job. And so I kept telling Brian no. And I had a long list of excuses, each of which he had a very credible response to. And my final ditch effort was, well, my wife is 8 months pregnant with our first child. I am not making two significant life changes at once. And
it's a big change.
All right.
So
about
did that work?
2 or 3 weeks after she was born, this like parenting stuff is not that hard. So I called Brian back and I accepted the job, which I realized only then that my in-laws were still visiting.
Right.
The baby slept a lot at weird times, but somehow it wasn't as hard as it got a little later. So it was 2 big life changes at once, but I'm really happy I did it. That was like 15 years ago. So.
That's awesome. So one of the things when we were talking before, when we were talking about doing this, we were talking a little bit about how Linux has really become a platform. And all of these other elements of innovation have spun up around this evolution of Linux. And I'd like you to talk a little bit and share everyone your perspective on that, because I think it's a really interesting way of looking at how open source has kind of evolved throughout the years and where you see the platform moving forward specifically.
Yeah, well, Linux is where I got started. I did my first Linux install on an old 486 box in my basement in probably 95 or something.
That was Slackware?
It was Slackware. It was a lot of floppies, and
boy,
you could be selective. You didn't have to pick. And a long time spent in configuring graphics, if you remember Xconfig and Xconfigurator and all that. So that was my experience with Linux in the very beginning, which was super fun, really interesting, like from a technologist point of view, the opportunity to get under the hood and see how things work. Totally love that. Nothing that I would call polished or easy to use, or mainstreamable at all. So as I got involved in doing Linux professionally and ultimately being in the position I'm in today, looking at the development of Linux not just as a kernel, but really a critical and core piece of technology that if you look at it today, it's absolutely everywhere.
Yeah.
I mean, I have an Android phone. It's in my pocket. It's in my TVs. It's cars,
yep.
planes, trains, servers. You can't imagine a place that doesn't have a Linux operating system running inside. What's associated with that is a ton of activity in two key areas. One is all of the open source projects around the world tend to be targeting Linux. Not exclusively, you can find exceptions to that, but there's just a vast array of excitement, enthusiasm, and innovation that happens in and around Linux, which is fun and fascinating. And then if you look at the commercial side, the whole industry is really rallied around this core platform. And I think that is what makes it so fundamentally valuable.
Right.
If you think about everything that you experience on a day-to-day basis, it's queries, it's social interactions through social media, all of these somewhere in the background or even in the foreground in your phone are powered by Linux, and there's a whole commercial ecosystem that has decided this is the platform that we're going to essentially de facto standardize our efforts around,
right.
which has enabled that, plus some clever engineering, has enabled Linux to evolve for, well, quarter century and stay relevant and
right.
be at the leading edge. So I think this notion of a platform is, we have these arguments internally. What's a platform? Because we have different layers. It could be an application platform. It could be infrastructure layers. But the notion that you have a place where people bring together a set of common requirements and then work on those together,
right.
and advance the entire state of the art for the whole industry. I mean, if 20 years ago, if you would have told me that billions of dollars a year would be spent into an open source based industry and some multiplier on that would be the money generated through all the transactions that are processed in those systems,
right.
I just wouldn't have believed you.
Right, I was going to say something similar, which is this has been a pretty short timeline for something so significant when you think it's not just the operating system, and it's all of the tool chain that's being built out as well. And of course, as the cloud has kind of evolved, as we've gone from kind of on-prem in through to the cloud and with the hybrid cloud as well, it's been incredible to see that this has all been wrapped around this platform and how we build software, right? How have you seen that, for example, change at Red Hat? Because in those years, I mean, Red Hat were well known in the early days, especially as being kind of one of the first early companies that were investing into free software and open source. And obviously, Red Hat is a hugely successful company today. How have you seen that relationship with the platform adjust and evolve over those years?
Well, one thing that has not changed, and this has surprised me, initially we had to get people over the kind of FUD associated with open source. Who are all these hippies in their basements writing code, and why am I running my business on it? That doesn't make sense. I don't believe you that it's safe.
Right.
That went away, but all of the kind of evangelism and education around open source, surprisingly to me, has not. So I spend a lot of my time talking to a lot of people about some of the same topics. And sometimes I think, okay, this is kind of boring. But what I realize is that's a form of success, because what that really means is there are continual new waves of people coming into this broad movement that
right.
was a fringe radical thing, and now it's completely mainstream.
Yeah.
So there's that, which has changed internally, and we've had different thoughts about how much open source needs to actually be a part of our messaging or not, because
right.
it depends on where the industry is. And then the notion of a platform and where we fit into the ecosystem and what we're trying to do has actually been kind of a binding glue throughout the longevity of our story. And today, that platform looks quite different, except it's still Linux at the very core, which is
right.
something that I really, really enjoy.
Yeah.
And when you think, the way I think about it is we're working on Linux and its servers and bespoke, the handcrafted special artisan snowflakes of an application on a server that you don't ever touch because you're afraid it will break, to today with mutable images, big scale out infrastructure, orchestration to manage all of this, which in my mind is Kubernetes, and the way the broad open source ecosystem and the vendor commercial ecosystem is rallying around that same kind of common technology point.
Right.
It's really exciting because that is playing the same kind of pattern out in a very new way, realizing things that I know I've worked on for decades, which is big, complicated clustering, distributed systems. None of those problems have gone away, but the way we've evolved and how we solve those problems is really emerged with some amazing technologies.
And where do you see the relationship of the distribution? Because back, for example, when you started out, and I also started out with Slackware as well, there was the notion of this collection of software that you bring together and you install a distribution, and that's where you go from. And now, of course, with the cloud and orchestration, the way in which we think about how we consume software is changing. How have you seen that adjust over the years as well?
Well, there's a small part of me that cries inside because I love the details and I love the complexity.
Right.
But I think
that might be why you're a CTO.
Maybe.
It may be.
I think that today, even people who also love the details, they just don't have time to become what I describe as mastering the arcane. We used to celebrate the most obscure command line argument and knowing that meant you were kind of a rock star. Today, if you can't do something quickly with essentially as minimal effort invested to get to an outcome that's important to you, then you're just not going to do it. And so the way software is consumed, I think, today is really, in large part, informed by what clouds have done and how you can consume software as a service. So being able to make it so easy to provision whatever it is you're trying to provision and engage with it quickly is the most critical thing. Which isn't the same as giving you 1,000 ways to tune something.
Oh, I see. So it's almost like the user interface to the technology, in many ways, is the distribution, right? The way in which you package up the technology and provide it.
That's right.
Is kind of, in many ways, is less relevant in some ways as it is back.
To make it sort of Red Hat specific, so it's concrete, one of the things that we do is take a bunch of different pieces and combine them together in a relatively well-defined and prescriptive way to help, we're trying to create this balance between choice and those thousands of configuration knobs and ease of use. And I wouldn't say we've got it perfect, but that's the difference of it was very much packaged and you install it, you've got all these kind of building blocks and Lego bricks, and you figure out what you're going to do. And today, being more prescriptive and being able to more kind of push button provisioning and ease of interactions is definitely the norm.
So it would be remiss if I didn't ask the question that I think a lot of people in here are going to be wanting to ask, which is, Red Hat was acquired by IBM. And I think
thought you were going to ask my favorite beer.
I would actually. What is your favorite beer? I do want to know.
Depends on the season. I mean, it's a complicated question. I love IPAs. I'm from Portland, Oregon.
Hipsters. All right. Okay. So, how would you describe the relationship between Red Hat and IBM today? Because I mean, we're all familiar with companies who get acquired and then they kind of go in and they become subsumed into, into the machine. And sometimes they lose their independence. They lose their identity a little bit. And obviously, Red Hat is a company that people hold pretty dearly in the open source world. And I think everybody is reassured by the fact that, of course, like Jim has led the company well, you've led the company well, some amazing engineers there. What's that relationship with IBM today, and where do you see it in the future?
The most common question I get is in this area, and it's really about what's going to change. And the focus that we have is we are a company that builds our products from open source projects. We will continue to do all of the work that we've always done in open source communities because it's so fundamental to who we are, how we operate, how we build our products, how we engage with our kind of partner ecosystem as well as our customers. So if you think about the major event, which is take a significant, a third of your market cap and put it down on a relatively small company. That's a major call it a major bet. And the thing that I'm really impressed by is the degree to which every conversation is supporting being committed to really Red Hat retaining a level of independence and the consistency, the identity of our brand, who we are, the culture of what we do, how we do it.
Right.
That is really front and center, because if you think about what value could we provide, it's not the intellectual property of a proprietary bunch of bits.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
It's all out there. So it's really who we are, what we do, how we do it, and then from our side, we actually have some things that we can gain, which is a certain type of breadth and scale that we wouldn't have been able to do on our own.
Right.
So I think there is some complementary capabilities there. So it's not like we have the better culture
right.
Versus their culture. It's really we have different strengths, and we're trying to figure out where we work together with
right.
predominant, like first class citizen in this one is Red Hat is Red Hat.
Right.
And we retain independence, because a lot of what we're building is around what we call the open hybrid cloud, and that's a shared vision.
Right, right.
So they want to accelerate that vision. We're building to that vision.
Yeah. And I think, anyone who knows Red Hat knows that culture has been a really critical element of it, the kind of the open source way, fundamental to that. So I want to broaden out a little bit, because we're seeing, I think, changes, not necessarily changes, but different ideas around what open source means in the last couple of years. So we've seen different attitudes towards free software, towards open source, what open core is. We're seeing new licenses that are coming out, such as Commons Clause. Different companies are coming in to invest in open source. We're seeing all of these different inputs. And I think a lot of people are looking at all of this activity and thinking, what does all of this mean? Where do we see the balance between all of these different ingredients that are being mixed into this mixing bowl? How do you see this? Where do you see open source moving forward with all of these different kind of inputs that are kind of coming into it?
Well, on the one hand, I see it as open source has won. And what I mean by that is everything I talked about at the beginning, the platform, the investment, all these open source communities, all this industry that's around these core platforms like Linux and Kubernetes.
Right.
That is unbelievable. I would not have believed you if you told me that's where we would be today 20 years ago. So open source is one, but that's come at a cost. And the way I describe it is it's the corporatization of open source. And now we have all these questions. There's so much financial interest involved in the health and vitality of these projects that there is a new set of kind of politics. A lot of things that we saw play out in standards bodies
right.
are kind of at risk of entering the open source communities, where it's not necessarily it's this collaboration, but it's really we're going to collaborate as long as you take my way.
Right.
So the idea that software could only be developed while supported by a foundation is an open question mark in my mind, and the relationship between the production of software, the developers and the community that build software together, and the consumers in an economic sense is also shifting. So we have all of these things. We've won, like we should celebrate. Come on,
right.
That's awesome.
Right.
Yay. Go, hello, still out there? But that it's come at some cost.
Right.
And the cost, I think, is how do we continue to onboard people into the communities while preserving the best of what we're capable of doing in how we build communities,
right.
which in my mind is, it's about people, it's about trust relationships, it's about a shared vision, about some technology that we mutually care about.
Right.
And distorting that with a lot of financial interest creates risk in preserving the culture.
And how do you feel like we strike that balance? Because I get the impression that what we're seeing right now is a lot of people, kind of like a kid, poking the edges of the universe, trying to find their boundaries of what open source really means. How do you think I think many people in here will have a gut sense of what those core principles are and what that means to differing degrees. How do you think we define those core principles and maintain them as we go through this process?
What I've done, write them down, evangelize them, bounce them off other people, see,
right.
Does this make sense? And then I think about it this way, an open source license, there's many of them, they fall into an entire spectrum. If you read those licenses, and I've read a lot of those licenses, it's very rare that the license says you have to give contributions back to the development community where this source code came from.
Right.
In fact, basically, it never says it exactly like that. There is an expectation that that happens, and that is a community and cultural expectation that's built from how we're operating together. Yeah. So yeah, we chose an Apache license, which is relatively unrestricted. We chose a GPL, which has a whole different set of requirements around it. Those actually don't say you have to give back. How do we ensure that that culture of collaboration and focusing on the enhancement of the software as a project that we all care about, which is quite distinct from how we may commercially productize it, is kept clear. Those boundaries need to be kept really clear. And the culture part of it is so fundamental and key. So I'd say it's write it down, share it with your friends, evangelize it, and make that a part of any software project that you're a member of.
And that's something that we all need to do.
Yeah, it's a collective. I mean, it doesn't.
Collective effort. It takes a village.
Person. Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you, Chris. It was a pleasure.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.